So it's worth analyzing Putin's Victory Day speech from yesterday, and he gives this speech every year. But not necessarily to look at what he said, because what he said was a bunch of the same old Russian rhetoric that we've heard for a few years now. It's more like what he chose to omit from the speech. For instance, Putin said nothing about winning the special military operation, saying only that Russia will protect its people. He didn't say anything about any of the successes, or there was no examples of heroism. He only said that he stands in solidarity with the soldiers on the front line, but didn't say anything about winning, which is strange because that is different than what he did last year. He also didn't mention NATO a single time, which is odd because that is who the Russian media constantly props up as the true enemy to Russia rather than Ukraine. Putin said nothing about NATO. He seems to be relying on this idea of praying for the front line. He talked about everyone is praying for them, and it makes me wonder if he has now turned to the thoughts and prayers tactics for potential hopeful change in Ukraine, or trying to play upon any kind of religiosity within Russia to try to bolster support. It's not really working at this point, but we'll see going forward. He talked about the whole country being united behind this effort in Ukraine, behind the soldiers on the front line, which is completely incorrect, as tens of thousands of Russians have protested and over 1 million Russians have fled the country to get away from what Putin is doing to Ukraine and the backlash from all of the Western world because of it. Frankly, anyone that has stayed in Russia but disagrees with the war is intimidated by the state with detention and criminal cases. In last year's speech, Putin assured the people everything was going to plan. Well, he didn't say that this year. No plans were laid out whatsoever, only rhetoric on keeping the Russian people secure. It's very vague. It's the type of speech that you give when you have nothing of importance to say, nothing of that is positive to say to your people. He spoke about some vague war that was waged against Russia. Again, but not using NATO. He just talks about the idea of some Western elites, and I'll talk about this in a bit. And this vague war that is being waged against Russia is a standard lie Putin likes to tell to garner support for what he's doing in Ukraine, when in fact it was him personally that brought his advisors into the room in February, where they sat across from him like 30 feet away, and he watched as they stuttered through sheepish agreement with Putin's wish to invade Ukraine. Russia is the invader, and Putin is the one that is enforcing this invasion, that gave the go-ahead, not even the go-ahead, but told everyone in his staff that they are going to agree or be fired or worse. And that's what we watched as they all stepped up to the podium in February and agreed with Putin on moving forward with this invasion. In the speech, he strangely talked about international terrorism, which is interesting because most of the terroristic acts that take place within Russia are a domestic terroristic act. They come from within. But when you look at what really is international terrorism, it's Putin's own rockets that are raining down upon innocent civilians across Ukraine, killing women and children. Russia is the cause of international terrorism in Ukraine. So it was a bit of an ironic take here. And the irony just was there was boundless irony in this whole speech. I mean, he replaced the words NATO with the words Western global elites, but in true Putin fashion, he projects on the West anything that is wrong with Russia. He says the West continues to impose, to dictate, to force their will on people, to force their will on people's rights and the rules of law, which is absolutely comical, as it is Russia that is literally imposing the will of a single authoritarian leader on the people of Russia and the people of Ukraine, removing those people's rights and by force making them capitulate to Putin's whims. Putin calls the West a system of robbery, violence, and suppression, which is very ironic And that irony is apparently lost on the Kremlin. I mean, seriously, Putin recently signed a law that Ukrainians in Russian-occupied territories must accept Russian citizenship or face deportation from the land they were born in. I don't know of a greater example of robbery, violence, and suppression than a country such as Russia violently invading another country such as Ukraine, robbing them of their resources, suppressing their ability to have any kind of protest to this, and then suddenly telling them that if you don't agree with Russian citizenship, you will be deported. That is robbery, violence, and suppression. That is what Putin is talking about when he says the West is fostering this system. No, it is Russia that is fostering this system. He also didn't say anything about the recent strikes in Russia, such as the strikes on fuel depots or airfields in places like Belgorod, Kursk, Bryansk, Rostov, etc., which is interesting because he wanted to talk about securing Russians, but he can't. They're being attacked, rightfully so, because they are the invader of another country. You're not special, Russia. When you start a war, that war can come to your territory as well. He said nothing about the Kremlin drone incident either. So I'm not entirely sure why he's saying we will protect Russians, but then not addressing the absolute attacks in Russian territory. However, he did what Putin always does. He gives a nod to those that he needs the most help from when he gave a shout out to China in its fight against Japan during World War II. But yet again, he did not acknowledge Soviet ties to Nazi Germany, and why would he, when the Soviets invaded Poland with Nazi Germany in 1939, and they had an agreement together from 1939 to 1941. And again, the reason he didn't say it because it doesn't fit the narrative, but also he made it a law to make it criminal to talk about Soviet ties to Nazi Germany. So once again, it's a nothing burger speech where he talks about the same old Russian rhetoric we've heard now from Putin for a few years, as well as omitting some key things, such as not talking about NATO, such as not talking about winning this special military operation, and also just giving vague nods to security in Russia without providing any real action for how he's going to secure Russia, because Russia is being attacked by Ukraine, rightfully so, because that's what happens when you invade another country. So there you go.